Sometimes the heart knows what it needs long before the mind catches up. For 37 winters, Bjorn the Bear-Heart had searched the world for something he couldn't name until he found it standing before him with a sword in her hand and defiance in her eyes, in the harsh Norse village of Ravenshollow, where winter could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Bjorn had returned from years of raiding with ships full of gold, but an empty heart. He'd seen enough of the world to know that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about finding someone who'd stand with you when everything fell apart. When he declared he wanted a woman who could fight, cook, and bear strong sons, the village elders thought he'd lost his mind. But Astrid the Shieldmaiden understood exactly what he meant. The question was, would she choose him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn crept across the fjord like a cautious animal, painting the ice-covered waters in shades of pearl and amber. In the village of Ravenshollow, smoke already rose from a dozen chimneys, carrying with it the scent of burning pine and the promise of another day's survival wrested from winter's grip. Astrid, Ironwool, stood at the edge of the training ground, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air as she watched the younger shield maidens practice their sword work. The clash of steel on steel rang across the frozen earth, a sound as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. At 26, she was past the age when most women had already chosen their path's marriage, motherhood, or the rare honor of remaining a permanent warrior in service to the clan. Yet here she stood, unwed and uncompromising, holding her mother's iron cooking pot in one hand while her sword hung at her hip. The pot was a thing of beauty in its own way, black as midnight and seasoned by 3 generations of strong women. Her grandmother had stirred countless meals in it during the harsh winters when the men were away raiding. Her mother had used it to feed not just her own family, but half the village during the famine years. Now it belonged to Astrid, though she wondered sometimes if she would ever have daughters of her own to pass it down to. "You're brooding again," said Ingrid Fairhair, approaching with her own practice sword, still steaming from the morning's work. At 23, Ingrid had already borne 2 healthy sons to her husband Olaf, yet she still came to training every dawn. "It doesn't suit you." Astrid smiled despite her dark thoughts. "I'm thinking, not brooding. There's a difference." "Thinking about what?" Ingrid wiped the sweat from her brow despite the cold. "About Bjorn the Bear-Heart's declaration last night?" The entire village was still talking about it. 3 days had passed since Bjorn Eriksson had returned from 5 years of raiding in the far lands. His 3 longships heavy with silver and amber, his crew weathered but wealthy. The village had expected him to choose a bride quickly, as was proper for a man of his standing. What they hadn't expected was his blunt announcement at the evening meal. "I don't want a lady," he had said, his voice carrying clearly across the great hall. "I want a fighter who'll cook, love, and bear sons." The words had fallen into the warm air like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and speculation through every corner of the village. Most men wanted wives who were skilled in domestic arts, certainly, but they also wanted them gentle, obedient, and preferably young enough to be easily molded to their husband's preferences. Bjorn's requirements were as unconventional as the man himself thought. Astrid had watched him from across the hall as he spoke, noting the way his broad shoulders filled his leather vest, the silver threads that now streaked his dark beard, the scars that marked his hands and forearms like a map of distant battles. He was handsome in the way that battle-tested men often were, not pretty, but commanding. There was something in his pale blue eyes that suggested depths most people never saw, stories that would take long winter nights to tell. "What do you think he meant by it?" Ingrid pressed, settling beside her on the wooden bench that overlooked the training ground. "I think he meant exactly what he said." Astrid watched 2 of the younger women attempt a complex defensive maneuver. and wince as one of them nearly took her partner's ear off. He wants a woman who can stand beside him, not behind him. And do you want to stand beside Bjorn the Bear-Heart? The question hung in the air between them like morning mist. Astrid had been asking herself the same thing for 3 sleepless nights. She had known Bjorn before he left. They had been childhood friends of a sort, though he was 7 years her senior. He had been kind to the gangly girl who preferred swords to sewing, had taught her how to properly grip a battle axe when the other boys mocked her attempts. But that had been years ago, before he became the Bear-Heart, before he earned his reputation as one of the most feared raiders in the northern seas. "I want to know who he's become," Astrid said finally. "The boy I knew was gentle underneath all that bluster. But 5 years of raiding can change a man, or reveal who he truly was all along." Before Astrid could respond, a commotion from the direction of the harbor drew their attention. A group of men were making their way up the hill toward the village center, their leader instantly recognizable by his massive frame and confident stride. Bjorn walked with the measured pace of a man who had learned to conserve his energy for when it truly mattered, his dark cloak billowing behind him in the morning wind. Beside him walked Eric Bloodaxe, his closest friend and second in command, a lean man with quick eyes and quicker wit. The two of them had been inseparable since boyhood, and Eric's loyalty to Bjorn was legendary among the crew. Behind them came a handful of other raiders, all of them bearing the marks of successful campaigns, good weapons, fine clothes, and the easy confidence that came from survival in dangerous places. "There's your chance to find out," Ingrid murmured, though her voice carried a note of warning. "Just remember, Astrid, some questions are easier to ask than to answer." The men paused at the edge of the training ground, and Astrid felt Bjorn's gaze settle on her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of her own appearance. She was dressed for practice in wool leggings and a leather tunic, her blonde hair braided back in the practical style favored by fighters. She was not, by any measure, trying to look attractive. Yet something in his expression suggested he found her exactly as she should be. Magnus Greybeard, the village elder, emerged from his hall to greet the returned raiders. At 63, Magnus had survived more winters than most men could count, and his counsel was valued by young and old alike. His gray beard reached nearly to his belt, and his weathered hands bore the calluses of a lifetime spent working wood, metal, and the harder material of human nature. "Bjorn Eriksson," Magnus called, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "I trust your ships are well secured for winter?" "I, Magnus." Pulled up beyond the tide line and covered. Bjorn's voice was deeper than Astrid remembered, roughened by years of shouting orders over wind and waves. "We've brought enough supplies to see everyone through the cold months and silver enough to buy what we lack." "Good. And have you given more thought to your requirements in a wife?" The question drew chuckles from some of the gathered villagers. The Bjorn's expression remained serious. "I have. My mind is unchanged." Magnus stroked his beard thoughtfully. "It's an unusual request, son. Most women are raised to excel in either the domestic arts or the warrior's path, not both. You're asking for something rare." "Rare things are usually the most valuable," Eric interjected with a grin. "And Bjorn has never been interested in common treasures." "Indeed." Magnus's shrewd eyes swept the crowd until they settled on Astrid. "Though I suspect such a woman, if she exists, might have her own opinions about what she wants in a husband." The words were clearly meant for her, and Astrid felt every gaze in the gathering turn her way. She could have deflected with humor, could have made some light comment that would have turned the attention elsewhere. Instead, she found herself standing and walking toward the group of men with the same measured confidence she brought to battle. "Magnus speaks truth," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "A woman with the skills you describe would not be easily won. She would want to know what her husband brings to the partnership beyond strength and silver. Bjorn's pale eyes fixed on hers, and she saw something flicker there, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. And what would such a woman value, do you think? Respect, Astrid replied without hesitation. A true partnership requires it. She would want to know that her husband sees her as an equal, not a prize to be won or a tool to be used. Respect must be earned by both parties, Bjorn said carefully, just as trust must be built through shared experience. Then you understand the challenge you've set yourself. Astrid allowed herself a small smile. It's not enough to declare what you want. You must prove you're worthy of receiving it. The silence that followed was charged with possibility and tension. Around them, the villagers watched with the avid attention of people who recognized they were witnessing something significant. Eric grinned openly, clearly delighted by the exchange, while Magnus nodded approvingly. Well spoken, both of you, the elder said finally. Perhaps, Bjorn, you would care to join us for the evening meal? The whole village would benefit from hearing your tales of distant lands. I would be honored, Bjorn replied, though his eyes never left Astrid's face. And perhaps afterward, if she's willing, Astrid and I would walk with me and continue our conversation. The invitation hung in the air like a challenge. Astrid felt her pulse quicken, though whether from excitement or apprehension she couldn't say. This was the moment of choice, the fork in the path that could lead her toward a future she had never dared to imagine clearly. I would be willing, she said, and heard Ingrid's sharp intake of breath beside her dot as the group began to disperse, each person returning to their daily tasks. Astrid caught Eric watching her with an expression of mingled concern and curiosity. He had been Bjorn's closest friend for more years than most marriages lasted, and if anyone understood what lay beneath the Bear-Heart's fierce reputation, it would be him. You know him well, she said, approaching the lean warrior as Bjorn moved off to speak with Magnus about winter preparations. I, as well as any man, can know another. Eric's voice carried the hint of an accent from the far northern settlements, where he had been born. We've shared enough battles to know each other's minds without words. Then tell me truly, what manner of man has he become? I knew the boy, but boys change when they taste blood and gold. Eric studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes taking her measure. He's become exactly what you'd expect from someone who was always too big for this village, too restless for an ordinary life. But the heart of him, that's unchanged. He still feeds stray dogs and remembers the names of fallen enemies. He still wakes from nightmares sometimes, though he thinks no one notices. Nightmares about what? The same things that haunt any man who's taken life. Eric's expression grew distant. But also about coming home to find everything gone. Family, friends, the whole village burned to ash. It's why he came back when he did, why he's ready to settle. A man can only run from his fears for so long before he needs to turn and face them. The conversation was interrupted by a call from across the training ground. One of the younger Shieldmaidens had managed to tangle her sword in her cloak during practice, and Astrid was needed to help untangle the mess. As she walked away, she felt Eric's words settling into her mind like seeds in fertile ground. The day passed with its usual rhythms: training, meal preparation, 1,000 small tasks. That kept the village functioning through the harsh months. But underneath the familiar routine, Astrid felt the pull of possibility, the sense that her carefully ordered life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. As evening approached and the time for her walk with Bjorn drew near, she found herself standing before the small mirror in her family's hall, wondering for perhaps the first time in years whether she should attempt to make herself more conventionally attractive. The thought lasted only a moment before she dismissed it with a shake of her head. If Bjorn the Bear-Heart truly wanted a fighter, then he would get one sword calluses, battle scars, and all that. The iron cooking pot sat on the shelf beside the mirror, its black surface reflecting the firelight like still water. Tomorrow, she would need to decide whether to begin preparing for a future that might include filling it with food for a family of her own. Tonight, she would take the first step toward finding out if such a future was even possible. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of another long winter. But for the first time in years, Astrid found herself looking forward to whatever the cold months might bring. The great hall of Ravenshollow had never felt smaller than it did that evening, packed as it was with every soul in the village who could walk, crawl, or be carried to witness what promised to be the most memorable feast of the winter season. The long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat, fresh bread, and barrels of ale that Bjorn's crew had brought back from their raids. But the food was merely backdrop to the real feast. The stories, the gossip, and the anticipation of what would unfold between the returned raider and the village's most formidable Shieldmaiden. Astrid sat near the center of one of the long tables, acutely aware of the curious glances directed her way. She had chosen her clothing carefully, not to appear more feminine, but to honor the occasion. Her best wool dress, dyed a deep blue that matched the winter sky, was cut simply but well, and over it she wore her mother's silver arm rings. Her hair was braided in the style of an unmarried woman, but she had woven small silver charms into the plaits, each one earned through acts of valor or skill. Across the hall, Bjorn held court at the high table beside Magnus, regaling the assembly with tales of distant shores and strange peoples. His voice carried easily through the warm air, rich with the cadences of a born storyteller. He spoke of markets in Miklagard, where silk was sold by the bolt, of ice mountains taller than the greatest trees, of battles fought under foreign stars. Yet, despite the drama of his tales, Astrid noticed that his gaze kept finding her across the crowded room. "It can't seem to stop looking at you," Ingrid murmured beside her, not bothering to hide her amusement. "I think the great Bear-Heart is nervous." "Nonsense," Astrid replied, though she had noticed the same thing. "Men like Bjorn don't get nervous. They get determined, perhaps. But there's something different about the way he looks at you, like he's trying to solve a puzzle." Before Astrid could respond, Magnus rose from his place at the high table, calling for silence with the authority that came from decades of leadership. The hall gradually quieted, though the undercurrent of anticipation remained palpable. "Friends," Magnus began, his weathered voice carrying to every corner of the room. "We have heard tales tonight of far places and distant peoples, but Bjorn Eriksson has returned to us not just with stories, but with a declaration that has set our whole village talking." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew what was coming, but the formal presentation of it still carried weight. As is proper for a man of his standing, Bjorn seeks a wife to share his hall and his future. But his requirements are ... unusual. Magnus paused for effect, stroking his gray beard. Perhaps it would be best if he spoke for himself. Bjorn rose slowly, his massive frame commanding attention without effort. In the firelight, his scars seemed more pronounced, his presence more formidable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried easily through the hushed hall. "I have seen much of the world these past 5 years," he began. "I have walked in halls where gold is common as pebbles, where men keep a dozen wives like cattle in a pen. I have fought beside warriors whose names are sung in a dozen languages, and I have buried friends whose courage will never be forgotten." He paused, letting his gaze sweep the room before settling on Astrid. "In all my travels, I learned one truth above all others. A man's greatest treasure is not what he can take, but what he can build. Not what he can conquer, but what he can protect. I have gold enough for comfort, silver enough for trade, and weapons enough for war. What I lack is a partner worthy of sharing the life I want to build." The hall was so quiet that the crackling of the central fire seemed loud as thunder. "I don't want a lady who will sit by the hearth and embroider while wolves circle our door," I don't want a child who needs protection more than she gives it. I want a woman who can stand beside me when the raiders come, who can feed our children with her own hands after helping me defend them with her sword. I want a fighter who knows that love is not just soft words and gentle touches, but the willingness to bleed for what matters most. Murmurs began to rise from the crowd. The Bjorn held up a hand for silence. Most of all, I want a woman who chooses me not because I can provide for her, but because she believes we can build something together that neither of us could create alone. I want a partner, not a possession. The words hung in the air like an incantation, and Astrid felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition so deep it seemed to resonate in her bones. This was not the conventional proposal of a Viking warrior seeking a suitable wife. This was something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious. This was an invitation to become something new together. But recognition was one thing, and acceptance another. Astrid rose from her place at the table, feeling every eye in the hall turn toward her. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. Those are fine words, Bjorn Eriksson. The words are like morning mist, beautiful to look upon, but gone when the sun rises. How does a woman know if a man truly means what he says, or if he merely speaks what he thinks she wants to hear? A collective intake of breath swept the room. No one had expected Astrid to challenge him so directly, so publicly. But Bjorn's expression showed no anger, only a deepening interest. "A fair question," he replied, "and one that deserves more than words in answer. I propose a trial." "What manner of trial?" Bjorn reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that caught the firelight like captured starfire. It was an arm ring of silver, intricately carved with patterns. That spoke of distant craftsmanship and considerable expense. But it was not the value of the piece that made Astrid's breath catch. It was the fact that he was offering it at all. Among the Norse, the giving of arm rings was not casual. It was a gesture that carried weight, that spoke of honor and serious intent. For a man to offer such a gift to an unmarried woman in front of the entire village was tantamount to a formal declaration of courtship. "I offer this as bond and symbol," Bjorn said, stepping down from the high table and walking toward her with measured steps. "Accept it, and we spend the season getting to know each other as we truly are. No false courtesies, no pretense. We hunt together, work together, talk together. At winter's end, if you find me worthy of your partnership, we speak vows. If not, you keep the ring as payment for your time, and I trouble you no more." He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his blue eyes, could smell the leather and steel scent that clung to him like morning mist. The ring lay in his open palm, beautiful and somehow significant beyond its material worth. "And if I find you unworthy of my partnership?" Astrid asked, though there was no hostility in her voice, only the need to establish that this arrangement cut both ways. "Then you have the same freedom to walk away." Bjorn's smile was slight, but genuine. A partnership entered unwillingly is no partnership at all. Astrid stared at the ring for a long moment, aware that accepting it would change everything. There would be no going back to the simple certainty of her unmarried life. No returning to the safety of known routines and unquestioned choices. Taking that silver circle would mean stepping into unknown territory with a man who was himself an unknown quantity. But as she looked into Bjorn's eyes, she saw something that decided her, not certainty, but hope. The hope of a man who had traveled the world only to discover that what he most wanted was a home worth defending, a partnership worth building. "I accept your proposal," she said, reaching out to take the ring from his palm. The silver was warm from his touch, and as she slipped it onto her arm, she felt the weight of possibility settle around her like a cloak. The hall erupted in cheers and applause, but Astrid barely heard them. She was too focused on the way Bjorn's face changed when she accepted his offer. the careful control giving way to something that looked very much like relief. "When do we begin?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Bjorn replied. "With the dawn hunt. I want to see how you handle yourself in the wild. And I want to see if you can keep up," Astrid said with a smile that held more challenge than promised dawn as the celebration swirled around them. Neither of them could have predicted how much that simple exchange would cost them both before winter's end. Dawn came reluctantly to the fjord, painting the ice-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold while the valley below remained shrouded in gray shadow. Astrid stood at the edge of the village, her hunting bow in hand and her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. She had risen before the sun, partly from habit and partly from the nervous energy that had kept her awake most of the night. The bow was her pride, crafted from yew by her own hands, its grip worn smooth by years of use. Unlike the heavy war bows favored by most warriors, this was built for precision and endurance, perfect for the long hunts that could mean the difference between feast and famine during the harsh winter months. She had carved small runes into the wood, protection symbols taught to her by her grandmother, and wrapped the grip with leather taken from her first solo kill. "You're early," came a deep voice from behind her. Astrid turned to find Bjorn approaching through the morning mist, and for a moment she was struck by how different he looked in hunting gear. Gone was the formal attire of the previous evening, replaced by practical wool and leather that had seen considerable use. His massive frame moved with surprising quiet, and she noticed that despite his size, he'd placed his feet with the careful precision of someone who understood that a snapped twig could mean the difference between success and failure. "I'm always early," she replied. "The game doesn't wait for sluggards." Wise words. Bjorn adjusted the pack on his shoulders, and Astrid caught sight of the weapons he carried, a hunting spear with a leaf-shaped iron point, a long knife for field dressing, and a recurved bow that looked like it had come from far eastern lands. "Though I suspect the deer will be sheltering deep in the forest today. This cold will drive them to the thickest cover they can find. Then we'll have to be smarter than the deer." Astrid shouldered her own pack, checking that her arrows were secure and her knife was loose in its sheath. "I know a valley 2 hours. Walk from here where they gather when the wind is sharp, protected from the north by a ridge, with a stream that doesn't freeze even in deep winter. You know the land well. I should. I've been hunting these hills since I was old enough to draw a bow." She struck out toward the tree line, setting a pace that was brisk but sustainable. "My father taught me that knowing the land is more important than skill with weapons. A hunter who understands where the game will be rarely comes home empty-handed." Bjorn fell into step beside her, and Astrid was pleased to note that he matched her pace without apparent effort. Whatever else his years of raiding had done, they had kept him in excellent condition. "Tell me about your father," he said as they entered the shadow of the pine forest. "I remember him, but only as a child remembers. Adults larger than life and mysterious. He was a good man who died too young." Astrid ducked under a low-hanging branch, her voice carefully neutral. "Fever took him when I was 15. That's when I learned that knowing how to hunt wasn't just useful, it was necessary. That must have been difficult. 15 is young to bear such responsibility. Young, perhaps, but not too young. I had good teachers." She paused to examine a track in the snow, noting the size and depth of the print. "My mother never remarried. She said she'd rather struggle with dignity than prosper with a man who saw her only as a convenience." Bjorn was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of understanding. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. "Everything I know about strength, I learned from watching her." Astrid straightened and continued walking, following a game trail that wound between moss-covered boulders. "She died 3 winters ago. Another fever, one that the healers couldn't break. I'm sorry for your loss." The words were simple, but they carried genuine sympathy rather than mere politeness. Astrid glanced at Bjorn, and saw something in his expression that made her think he understood grief from personal experience. "What about your family?" she asked. "I remember your father, but I was young when he died. Drowned when his fishing boat was caught in a sudden storm. I was 22, old enough to understand that the sea gives and takes as it pleases." Bjorn stepped carefully around a patch of ice-covered stone. "My mother followed him the next winter. The healer said her heart simply gave out, but I think she died of loneliness." "Is that why you went raiding? To escape the loneliness?" Bjorn considered the question as they walked. The only sounds the crunch of snow under their feet and the distant call of ravens in the trees above. "Partly," he said finally, "but also because I was angry. At the sea, at the gods, at the unfairness of it all. I thought if I could win enough gold, if I could make a name that would be remembered in songs, somehow that would balance the scales. And did it? No." His answer was immediate and certain. "Gold doesn't fill the empty places in a man's heart, and fame is cold comfort on a winter night. I learned that a reputation won with a sword is only as good as the men who remember it, and most of them are dead now." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following the game trail as it wound deeper into the forest. Astrid found herself reassessing her companion with each step. The man beside her was not the legendary Bear-Heart she had imagined, all swagger and conquest. This was someone who had paid for his wisdom with genuine loss, who understood that strength without purpose was just another form of emptiness. The trail led them up a steep slope covered in pine and birch, their branches heavy with snow that occasionally dumped its burden on the unwary. At the crest of the ridge, Astrid called a halt and pointed down into the valley beyond. "There," she said softly. "Do you see them?" Bjorn followed her gaze and nodded. Below them, perhaps 200 paces away, a small herd of deer moved through the trees near a stream that glinted like silver in the weak morning light. Even from this distance, they could see the animal's breath steaming in the cold air. 8 adults, Bjorn observed, his voice barely above a whisper. 2 stags, 6 does. Good size on the males. The wind is in our favor, and the cover is good. Down the right side of the slope. Astrid studied the terrain with a practiced eye. "If we move carefully, we can get within 50 paces before they notice us." "Your hunt, your plan," Bjorn said, and Astrid was surprised by how readily he deferred to her expertise. "How do you want to approach this?" She explained her strategy quickly, a careful descent along the ridgeline, then a slow approach through the heaviest cover. They would position themselves on opposite sides of the herd's likely escape route, ensuring that even if the deer bolted, one of them would have a clear shot. "Remember," she concluded, "we only need one. Take the shot that presents itself, but don't force it. Better to return empty-handed than to wound an animal we can't track." Bjorn nodded his understanding, and they began the careful descent. Moving through snow and forest without sound required patience and skill, qualities that Astrid was pleased to see Bjorn possessed in abundance. Whatever else his raiding years had taught him, they had given him the ability to move like a ghost. When necessary, as they reached their positions and settled in to wait for the perfect moment, Astrid found herself watching Bjorn as much as the deer. This was the real test. Not whether he could make pretty speeches or offer expensive gifts, but whether he could work as part of a team when success demanded patience, skill, and trust. The hunt had been a success, yielding a fine stag that would feed several families through the next week. But as Astrid sat in her family's hall 3 days later, staring at the loom weights that lay scattered across the floor like fallen stars, she wondered if her other endeavors would prove so fruitful. The stone weights had been her grandmother's, carved with intricate patterns and worn smooth by generations of use. Each one was perfectly balanced, designed to keep the vertical threads of the loom taut while horizontal threads were woven between them. They were precision tools, requiring patience and skill to use properly qualities that Astrid possessed in abundance when hunting or fighting, but which seemed to abandon her entirely when faced with the demands of domestic crafts she had broken. Them, in a moment of frustration, swept them from the loom with an angry gesture when the pattern she was attempting, a complex design meant for a wedding cloak, had tangled for the third time that morning. Now they lay broken on the floor, some cracked cleanly in half, others shattered into fragments too small to be useful. Struggling with something? Ingrid asked from the doorway, her tone carefully neutral. Struggling with everything, Astrid replied, gesturing helplessly at the mess. How did our mothers make this look so easy? I can track a deer through a snowstorm, but I can't manage to weave a simple pattern without destroying the equipment. Ingrid entered and knelt beside the scattered weights, picking up the larger pieces and examining them with a practiced eye. Some of these can be repaired, others ... She shook her head sadly. I'm sorry, Astrid. I know these meant a great deal to you. They were the last thing I had of hers. Astrid's voice was barely above a whisper. My grandmother taught 3 generations of women to weave with those weights. Now they're ruined because I have no patience for work that requires sitting still. Is that what this is really about? The loom weights, or the fact that Bjorn expects you to excel at everything? Astrid looked up sharply. He's never said that. He doesn't need to say it. You've convinced yourself that to be worthy of his unconventional proposal, you need to be perfect at both paths, the warrior and the wife. But Astrid, no one is perfect at everything. His first wife would have been. The words slipped out before Astrid could stop them, revealing a fear she had barely acknowledged to herself. Bjorn had never spoken of previous relationships, but a man of his age and status would have had opportunities. The thought that he might be comparing her to some idealized memory made her stomach clench with anxiety. His first wife? Ingrid settled beside her friend, her expression curious. What first wife? Bjorn has never been married. But surely, no, Astrid. Ask anyone in the village. Bjorn Eriksson has courted no woman seriously, wed no one, fathered no children. Whatever you're worrying about, it's not based in truth. The relief that flooded through Astrid was so intense it left her dizzy. She had been competing with a phantom, measuring herself against a standard that existed only in her own imagination. Then, why do I feel like I'm failing at everything I attempt? She asked. Because you're trying to become someone else instead of being the best version of yourself. Ingrid's voice was gentle but firm. Bjorn didn't ask for a perfect domestic goddess. He asked for a fighter who could also cook and bear children. There's a difference. Before Astrid could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. She opened it to find Bjorn standing in the afternoon light, a wooden bucket in his hands and an expression of mild concern on his face. Ingrid mentioned you might need help with something, he said, his gaze taking in the scattered loom weights, and Astrid's obvious distress. I brought water from the well, in case you were planning to cook something. It was such a practical offer, delivered with such complete absence of judgment, that Astrid felt tears threaten for the first time since her mother's death. Here was a man offering to help with the simplest of domestic tasks, not because he doubted her capability, but because he recognized that everyone needed assistance sometimes. I was trying to weave a cloak, she said, gesturing at the ruined loom. I thought I wanted to show you that I could manage the domestic arts as well as the warrior skills. But I'm hopeless at it. Bjorn set down the bucket and knelt to examine the broken weights, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he sorted through the pieces. These are beautiful. Old work from someone who understood both craft and art. They were my grandmother's. I destroyed them because I have no patience for sitting still and following patterns. Patterns can be relearned, and patience. Bjorn! smiled slightly. Patience is something I'm still working on myself. 5 years of raiding teaches you to move fast and strike hard. Domestic life requires different skills. You're being kind. I'm being honest. He stood and faced her directly. Astrid, I didn't ask you to court me because I thought you were perfect. I asked because I thought you were real. A real woman with real strengths and real challenges. Not some impossible ideal who never struggles with anything. But if I can't manage something as simple as weaving, then we'll find someone to teach you. Or we'll hire someone to do the weaving. Or we'll wear simple clothes and not worry about it. His voice was patient but firm. There are 100 solutions to any domestic problem. What there isn't a solution for is a partnership built on false expectations. Ingrid, who had been watching this exchange with growing satisfaction, cleared her throat diplomatically. I should return to my own family. But Astrid, remember what I said about being yourself. After she left, Bjorn and Astrid stood in the quiet hall. The broken loom waits between them like a metaphor for all the ways that good intentions could go wrong. Would you walk with me? Bjorn asked. There's something I want to show you. They walked through the village and up the hill to the small grove where the village's ancestors were buried. Among the weathered stones and ancient trees, Bjorn led her to a simple marker carved with runes she couldn't read. My father's grave, he explained. He was a fisherman, not a warrior. Never won glory in battle, never sailed beyond the next fjord. But he was the wisest man I ever knew. What did he teach you? That there's no shame in being good at some things and poor at others. That the measure of a person isn't their perfection, but their willingness to keep trying. Bjorn's voice grew thoughtful. He also taught me that the strongest partnerships are built on complementary strengths, not identical abilities. Meaning? Meaning maybe you don't need to be excellent at weaving. Maybe I don't need to be the perfect hunter. Maybe what we need is to be excellent together at the things that matter most, protecting what we love, building something lasting, facing whatever comes with courage and honesty. As they walked back toward the village, Astrid felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anxiety that had been growing since she accepted his proposal. Perhaps Ingrid was right. Perhaps the path forward wasn't about becoming someone else, but about becoming the best version of who she already was. That evening, as she prepared a simple meal for them both, she found herself humming an old song. Her mother used to sing. When Bjorn complimented the food, she didn't deflect with self-deprecation or apologize for its simplicity. Instead, she simply said thank you and meant it. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something important. The war horn's deep, mournful call echoed across the fjord just as the sun reached its pale winter zenith, cutting through the afternoon stillness like a blade through flesh. Astrid was in the armory, checking the edge on her sword when the sound reached her ears. She knew that call, 3 long blasts followed by 2 short ones, the signal that enemies had been spotted approaching the village borders. Her blood sang in response, the familiar rush of anticipation that came before battle flooding her veins with fire and purpose. This was what she had trained for since childhood, what every practice session and sparring match had been preparing her for. Real combat, where mistakes meant death and victory meant survival for everyone she loved. The ancient horn that made. The call was carved from the tusk of some massive sea beast, its surface etched with protective runes and stained dark with age. It had summoned the warriors of Ravenshollow to battle for 3 generations, and its voice was as familiar to the villagers as their own heartbeats. When it sounded, every able-bodied fighter responded without question or hesitation. Astrid emerged from the armory to find the village already transforming into a hive of purposeful activity. Women gathered children and herded them toward the reinforced longhouse at the village's heart. Men rushed to collect weapons and armor, Their faces set with the grim determination of those who understood that everything they cherished hung in the balance. The elderly took up positions where they could observe and signal, their eyes sharp despite their failing bodies. Bjorn appeared at her side, as if summoned by thought, his own sword already in hand and his shield slung across his back. In the harsh light of impending conflict, he looked like what he truly was, a warrior tested by countless battles, scarred by survival, and hardened by the knowledge that violence was sometimes the only answer to violence. "How many?" Astrid asked, checking that her knife was secure at her belt. "Scout reports 15 raiders from the Bloodraven clan, moving fast through the eastern pass." Bjorn's voice was calm, professional. "They're likely testing our defenses, seeing if we've grown soft during the peaceful years. 15 is manageable if we choose our ground well." Astrid tested the grip on her shield, feeling the familiar weight settle against her arm. The bottleneck near the eastern stream? My thinking exactly. Force them to come at a single file. Use the terrain to our advantage. Bjorn's eyes found hers, and in them she saw not the uncertainty of a suitor, but the steady confidence of a battle-tested leader. "You've fought raiders before?" "3 times. Twice when I was younger. Once 2 summers ago, when a group tried to steal our harvest stores." Astrid's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating simple truth. "I've killed 6 men in combat and wounded others who lived to retreat." If Bjorn was surprised by her directness, he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded approvingly. "Good. Real experience is worth more than all the training in the world. How do you prefer to fight?" "Fast and close. I'm not strong enough to overwhelm opponents, so I rely on speed and precision." She adjusted her grip on her sword, a weapon she had commissioned from the village's best smith, lighter than most war swords, but perfectly balanced for her fighting style. "You? Direct assault when possible, tactical when necessary. 5 years of raiding teaches you to adapt quickly." Bjorn glanced toward the eastern hills where smoke signals were already rising. Today feels like a day for tactics. They moved together toward the gathering point, where Magnus was organizing the village's defense. The elder's face was grave, but determined, his own sword, though he hadn't used it in combat for a decade, hanging at his side. Around him, the village's fighters gathered in loose groups, checking equipment and sharing quick words of encouragement. "Bjorn, Astrid," Magnus called as they approached. "The scouts report the raiders are moving carefully, suggesting they know our capabilities. This isn't a desperate assault, it's a probe. Which means they'll retreat if they meet serious resistance," Bjorn said. "They're not here to die gloriously, just to test whether we're worth the effort of a larger attack." "Exactly. So we give them a lesson they'll remember." Magnus's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Show them that Ravenshollow still breeds warriors worth fearing." The plan was simple, as the best plans often were. Half the fighters would take position at the stream bottleneck, using the narrow passage to negate the raiders' numerical advantage. The other half would circle through the forest and attack from behind once the enemy was committed to the frontal assault. It was a classic pincer movement, one that required precise timing and absolute trust between the two groups. "I'll take the flanking force," Bjorn said. "Astrid, you're with me." "No," she replied firmly. "I should be with the forward group. They'll need every experienced fighter they can get." "Astrid, this isn't about courtship or protection, Bjorn. This is about putting our best fighters where they'll do the most good." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned her place through proven capability. "Eric can handle the flanking maneuver as well as you can, and you're needed where the fighting will be heaviest." For a moment, tension crackled between them, not the tension of romantic uncertainty, but the older conflict between protective instinct and practical necessity. Then Bjorn nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her words, even if every fiber of his being wanted to keep her close. where he could watch over her. "You're right. Eric, take 8 men and circle through the pine grove. Give us time to get into position, then hit them hard when they're focused on us." "Understood." Eric's grin was sharp as his blade. "Try to leave some for us." As the groups separated, Astrid found herself moving through the forest with 7 other fighters, all of them people she had known since childhood, all of them veterans of previous raids. There was Ulf the smith's son, whose hammer had taught him to strike with devastating force. Tormund the hunter, whose patience and steady hand made him deadly with a spear. Olga Ironside, a woman nearly Astrid's age who had chosen the warrior's path over marriage and never regretted it. They reached the stream bottleneck just as the first raiders came into view. Lean men in studded leather, their faces painted with blue and black designs that marked them as followers of the Blood Raven. They moved with the easy confidence of predators who had grown accustomed to easy prey, their weapons held casually, their attention focused on what lay ahead rather than what might be waiting for them. "Remember," Astrid whispered to the fighter beside her, "let them get fully committed before we reveal ourselves. Once the fighting starts, watch each other's backs and don't get separated." The raiders approached the narrow passage between the stream and the rocky outcropping, exactly as anticipated. From her position behind a fallen log, Astrid could see their leader, a tall man with silver arm rings and scars that spoke of many successful raids. He gestured for his men to advance in single file, clearly recognizing the tactical disadvantage, but apparently confident that their numbers would be sufficient. They were about to learn otherwise. As the first raider stepped into the killing ground, Astrid felt the familiar calm that always came before battle, the sharpening of senses, the slowing of time, the absolute focus that made everything except survival fade into unimportance. Beside her, she could feel Bjorn's presence like a physical force, steady and reassuring. The horn sounded again, a single, commanding blast that served as the signal to attack. The battle lasted less than an hour, but in that brief span of violence, everything changed between Bjorn and Astrid. When the last raider fled back toward the eastern passes, leaving 4 of their number dead in the snow and carrying 3 wounded companions, both knew they had found something rare and precious, a partnership forged in fire and proven in blood. Astrid sat by the stream, methodically cleaning her sword with a rag that was already stained red. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, her movements practiced and efficient. She had taken a shallow cut across her left forearm during the fighting, and blood had soaked through the hastily tied bandage. But she seemed unaware of the injury. "Let me see that," Bjorn said, settling beside her with his own sword across his knees. His shield bore new scratches and a dent where a raider's axe had struck, but he had emerged from the fight largely unscathed. "It's nothing serious," Astrid replied, but she extended her arm without resistance. "Just a reminder to keep my guard higher next time." Bjorn examined the wound with careful attention, his large fingers surprisingly gentle as he unwrapped the crude bandage. The cut was clean and not too deep, but it would need proper cleaning and fresh binding to heal without infection. "You fought well," he said as he worked, using water from the stream to wash away the dried blood. "I've seen seasoned warriors with less composure in their first real battle. This wasn't my first real battle." "No, but it was the first time you fought beside someone you cared about." Bjorn's voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. "That changes everything. It's harder to maintain focus when part of your mind is always aware of where your partner is, whether they're safe, whether they need help." Astrid looked at him sharply. "Did I compromise the fight? Put others at risk because I was distracted? No. If anything, you fought better than I expected, but I could see the effort it cost you to balance awareness of my position with attention to your own opponents." Bjorn began rewrapping her arm with clean cloth torn from his own shirt. "It's something all warrior couples must learn how to Fight as individuals while remaining connected as partners. Warrior couples? The words felt strange in her mouth, laden with implications she was still learning to accept. What else would you call us? Bjorn secured the bandage with careful knots. We just proved we can stand back to back against enemies and trust each other completely. In my experience, that's rarer than love and more valuable than gold. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the village returning to normal routines. The wounded were being tended, the dead honored with proper words, and the practical work of strengthening defenses against future attacks had already begun. Life in Ravenshollow went on, as it always did, but something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between the returned raider and the village Shieldmaiden. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Astrid said eventually. "About what it means to be partners in everything, not just in battle. And I think I understand it better now. When you were fighting, part of me was always aware of where you were, whether you needed help, whether you were safe. But it didn't weaken me. It made me more determined, more focused." She paused, searching for the right words. It felt like fighting for something larger than myself. Bjorn nodded slowly. "That's exactly right. When you have something worth protecting, it changes how you approach everything. Makes you smarter, more careful, more fierce when necessary. Is that why you came back? Because you realized you needed something worth protecting?" "Partly. But also because I realized that protection works both ways. I spent 5 years learning that no matter how strong or skilled you are, there are always situations where you need someone watching your back, someone you can trust completely." His pale eyes found hers. "Someone who'll fight beside you instead of cowering behind you." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of young Torment, who had taken a spear thrust to the thigh during the fighting. He limped toward them with a grin that spoke of victory pride despite his injury. "Magnus wants to see you both," he called. "Says there's something important to discuss about the raid." They found the village elder in his hall, surrounded by maps and talking quietly with Eric and several other senior warriors. Magnus looked up as they entered, his weathered face showing both satisfaction and concern. "Good work today, both of you," he said without preamble. "The Bloodraven clan won't be testing our defenses again anytime soon. But this attack raises questions about what may be coming." "You think it was more than a simple probe?" Astrid asked. "I think it was exactly what it appeared to be, a test of our strength and resolve. The question is whether we passed or failed in their estimation." Magnus gestured to the maps spread across his table. "They retreated quickly when faced with organized resistance, but they also gathered valuable intelligence about our numbers, our tactics, and our capabilities." Eric leaned forward, his expression serious. "There are rumors from the trading posts that several clans are forming alliances for the spring raiding season. If they're sharing information about potential targets, then we could be facing something much larger than 15 raiders next time," Bjorn finished. "A coordinated assault designed to overwhelm our defenses." "Exactly. Which means we need to be thinking beyond simple defense." Magnus's eyes were sharp, despite his age. "We need allies of our own, and we need them before the snows melt." The discussion continued for another hour, covering potential allies, defensive improvements, and the delicate diplomacy required to forge alliances without appearing weak. But throughout the conversation, Astrid found herself increasingly aware of how naturally she and Bjorn worked together, finishing each other's thoughts, building on each other's ideas, approaching problems from complementary angles. When they finally left Magnus's hall, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. They walked toward Astrid's family hall in comfortable silence, both lost in thought about the day's events and their implications. "Bjorn," Astrid said as they reached her door. When this is over, when we've dealt with whatever threat is coming, what then? What kind of life do you see us building together?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of dreams that had been carefully considered and deeply felt. "I see a hall where children learn to be strong but not cruel, where guests are welcome but enemies fear to tread. I see fields worked by our own hands, hunts shared in partnership, winters warmed by more than just fire." He turned to face her directly. "I see a home worth defending and a family worth dying for, built by two people who chose each other not from need or convenience, but from recognition. Recognition of what? Of finding someone who makes you want to be worthy of them, while accepting you exactly as you are." As Astrid watched him disappear into the gathering darkness, she fingered the silver arm ring he had given her and allowed herself to imagine the future he had described. For the first time since accepting his proposal, it felt not like a burden to be carried, but like a gift to be treasured. The marriage cloak lay spread across Astrid's bed like a field of midnight stars, its deep blue wool interwoven with silver, threads that caught the firelight and threw it back in gentle gleams. She had been working on it for weeks, her fingers finally learning the patience required for the intricate patterns that would mark it as a garment worthy of a warrior's wedding. Each stitch was a small victory over her earlier frustrations. Each completed section a testament to her growing understanding that strength could take many forms. Winter had deepened around Ravenshollow, bringing with it the kind of cold that made metal brittle and turned breath to ice crystals in the air. But inside the hole, warmed by the central hearth and the satisfaction of meaningful work, Astrid had found a peace she hadn't known she was seeking. The courtship with Bjorn had evolved from uncertain testing to something that felt as natural as breathing, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of deep affection that grew stronger with each passing day. That peace shattered like thin ice under a warhammer when the messenger arrived. Astrid was adjusting the silver clasps that would secure the cloak when she heard the commotion. Outside voices raised an alarm, the sound of running feet, and underneath it all, the distinctive whistle that meant urgent news from the border watch. She set down her needle and reached instinctively for her sword belt, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing in the months since the Bloodraven raid. The messenger was a young man from the eastern settlements, his face drawn with exhaustion and something darker fear, perhaps, or the kind of shock that came from witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the world. He stood in Magnus's hall surrounded by the village elders, his travel-stained clothes steaming in the warm air as he delivered news that would change everything. "The message came 3 days ago," he was saying as Astrid entered, "carved into a runestone and left where our scouts would find it." The words were burned into the wood, not carved burned, as if written with fire itself. Magnus held the stone in his weathered hands, his face grave as he examined the markings. "Read it again, boy. Make sure we understand exactly what was said." The messenger's voice shook slightly as he recited the words that had been burned into the ancient wood. "To Astrid Ironwill of Ravenshollow, greetings from one who shares your blood. I am Ragnar, your brother, who you believe died in the failed raid on Whales Bay 5 winters past. I live and I serve Thorvald the Cruel as his champion and right hand. He offers you a choice: join us willingly and take your place among the greatest warriors of the age, or watch as your precious village burns and all you love turns to ash. You have until the new moon to decide. If you refuse, your brother dies with the first assault, and his blood will be on your hands." The words fell into the hushed hall like stones into deep water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through everyone present. Astrid felt the world tilt around her, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become uncertain. Ragnar alive? Her brother, who she had mourned for 5 long years, who she had believed died screaming under foreign swords in a raid gone wrong. "It cannot be," she whispered, though even as she spoke, part of her recognized the terrible possibility that it was true. Bodies had never been recovered from the Whales Bay disaster. They had assumed that the sea had claimed them, as the sea claimed so many who dared to challenge its fury. Bjorn appeared at her side, as if summoned by her distress, his presence solid and reassuring in a world that had suddenly become fluid and uncertain. "The handwriting," he said to Magnus. "Do we have anything to compare it to?" "I saved some of Ragnar's practice runes from when he was learning to write," Magnus replied slowly. "They're old, but—" He disappeared into the back of his hall and returned with a wooden tablet covered in the careful, childish marks of a boy learning his letters. The comparison was brief, but conclusive. The mature hand that had burned the message bore unmistakable similarities to the child's uncertain scratches. "It's him," Astrid said, the words feeling like broken glass in her throat. Somehow, impossibly, it's really him. The hall erupted in discussion as the implications became clear. Thorvald the Cruel was legendary among the northern clans, a warlord who had built his reputation on brutality and tactical brilliance in equal measure. If he had indeed saved Ragnar from the wreckage of the Whales Bay raid, if he had spent 5 years turning her brother into his champion, then the threat to Ravenshollow was far greater than anyone had imagined. "We have to assume the worst," Eric said grimly. "If Thorvald has been planning this for years, gathering information about our defenses, our capabilities, our weaknesses, then the Bloodraven raid was just the beginning," Bjorn finished. "A final test before the real assault." Magnus spread maps across the table, his fingers tracing the approaches to their village. "Thorvald commands over 100 warriors, all of them seasoned raiders. In a direct assault, we couldn't hold them for more than a few hours. But if we evacuate," one of the younger men began. "Where?" Magnus's voice was patient but firm. "This is our home, our land, our heritage. Everything we are is tied to this place. And even if we could abandon it, Thorvald would simply hunt us down at his leisure. Running isn't a solution, it's just a slower way to die." All eyes turned to Astrid, and she felt the weight of impossible choice settling on her shoulders like a cloak made of lead. Save her brother by betraying everything else she loved, or defend her home by condemning Ragnar to death. Choose between blood family and chosen family, between the past and the future, between loyalty and love. "What does your heart tell you?" Bjorn asked quietly, his voice meant for her alone, though everyone could hear it in the hushed hall. "My heart is broken," Astrid replied honestly. "Part of me wants to ride out immediately, to see him with my own eyes, to know what 5 years with Thorvald has done to the boy I remember. But double quote. But I know it's a trap. Even if Ragnar is truly alive, even if some part of him still remembers who he was, Thorvald wouldn't offer this choice unless he was certain of the outcome. He wants me to come to him, wants to use me as a weapon against my own people." The discussion continued deep into the night, exploring every possibility, every strategy, every desperate hope for a solution that might save both Ragnar and Ravenshollow. But as the hours passed and the fire burned low, the truth became increasingly clear. There was no perfect choice, no clever plan that could resolve the situation without terrible cost. "I need time to think," Astrid said finally. "Time to decide what matters most." As the gathering dispersed, Bjorn lingered beside her, his presence offering comfort without words. They walked together to her hall, where the marriage cloak still lay spread across the bed like a promise of happiness that now seemed impossibly distant. "If I go to him," Astrid said quietly, "our courtship ends. Even if I survive, even if I somehow manage to save both Ragnar and the village, I'll be forever marked as someone who chose blood over bond. And if you stay, then my brother dies, and I live with that choice for the rest of my days." She touched the silver arm ring he had given her, its weight now feeling like a shackle rather than a promise. "How do I choose between two kinds of loyalty?" How do I decide which love matters more? Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting the dying firelight. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Maybe the choice isn't between loyalties, he said slowly. Maybe it's about finding a way to honor both. Your brother is alive, which means there's still hope. Thorvald is confident, which means he's likely to make mistakes. And we have something he doesn't expect. What's that? Each other. A partnership he can't understand because he's never experienced it. Men like Thorvald see the world in terms of dominance and submission, strength and weakness. They don't understand that two people fighting as one can be stronger than a dozen fighting alone. Astrid felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest, small but growing. You think there's a way to save him? I think there's a way to try. And I think trying together gives us a better chance than either of us would have alone. Bjorn's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that spoke of unshakable commitment. Whatever you decide, Astrid, we decide together. That's what partnership means. As she looked into his eyes, Astrid saw not just love, but understanding, the recognition that some choices were too difficult to bear alone, and that the strength to make them came not from certainty, but from the knowledge that someone would stand with you regardless of the consequences. The marriage cloak lay forgotten on the bed as they planned through the night, two minds working as one to find a path through the darkness that had descended upon their world. The shield was older than Bjorn himself, its wooden face scarred by countless battles and reinforced with iron bands that bore the marks of his father's hammer. Eriksson the shipwright had carried it through 20 years of conflict before age and wisdom convinced him to lay down his weapons in favor of peaceful pursuits. Now his son lifted it from its place of honor above the family hearth, feeling the weight of generations settling across his arm. Are you certain about this? Eric asked from the doorway, his voice carrying the concern of a friend who had shared too many desperate plans to have much faith in their success. Once we commit to this path, there's no retreat, no negotiation, no clever words that will save us if it goes wrong. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Bjorn replied, adjusting the shield's worn leather grip to fit his hand. Astrid has made her choice. She stand and fight for Ravenshollow, regardless of the cost. The least I can do is make sure she doesn't face that fight alone. 3 days had passed since the messenger's arrival. 3 days of frantic preparation and agonizing debate. The village had transformed itself into an armed camp, with every able-bodied person contributing to the defense in whatever way they could. Children too young to fight had been taught to carry messages and tend wounds. Elders past their fighting prime had taken up positions as lookouts and advisors. Even the animals seemed to sense the tension, with dogs growing restless and horses shying at shadows. But underneath all the practical preparations lay the deeper question that everyone understood, but no one dared voice directly. How do you fight an enemy who holds your heart hostage? The plan is sound, Magnus said, joining them in the armory where weapons were being distributed and last-minute adjustments made to defensive positions. Risky beyond measure, but sound. If we can convince Thorvald that Astrid is truly coming, to him, if we can get close enough to strike, then we might be able to rescue Ragnar and eliminate the threat in one action. Bjorn finished. Or we might all die gloriously and leave the village defenseless. There's no middle ground in this. Gamble. There never is, Astrid said, emerging from the shadows where she had been listening to their conversation. She was dressed for war in leather and mail, her sword at her side, and her face painted with the blue and white patterns that marked her as a daughter of Ravenshollow. But it was the shield across her back that drew their attention, Bjorn's father's shield, the one he had just offered her as both protection and symbol. You don't have to carry it, Bjorn said, though his voice carried pride as well as concern. It's heavy, and you're not used to fighting with a shield that size. I'm carrying it because of what it represents, Astrid replied, adjusting the straps so the ancient wood sat properly across her shoulders. Your father was known for his loyalty, his courage, and his willingness to stand with his friends when everything seemed hopeless. If I'm going to face my brother across a battlefield, I want to carry something that reminds me what those virtues look like. The gesture was more than symbolic. It was a declaration of complete trust and partnership that made Eric whistle softly under his breath. Among the Norse, offering one's ancestral shield to another was a sign of the deepest respect and commitment. For Astrid to accept it was equally significant, marking her as someone willing to bear the weight of Bjorn's family honor alongside her own. Then we're committed, Magnus said with finality. May the gods grant us the wisdom to succeed and the strength to fail well if we must. The plan they had devised was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Astrid would approach Thorvald's camp under the pretense of accepting his offer, accompanied by a small escort that would appear to be nothing more than an honor guard. Once inside the enemy encampment, they would locate Ragnar and attempt to rescue him while simultaneously eliminating Thorvald and as many of his key lieutenants as possible. The chaos of the assassination would hopefully allow them to escape before the remaining raiders could organize an effective pursuit. It was, as Eric had noted, a plan with no room for error and no possibility of retreat. Success would save both the village and Ragnar. Failure would doom them all. The timing has to be perfect, Bjorn said, reviewing the details one final time. We enter the camp at sunset, when the light is poor and the guards are changing shifts. That gives us the best chance of getting close to their leaders without being detected as a threat. And if Ragnar doesn't want to be rescued? Astrid asked quietly. 5 years with Thorvald could have changed him completely. He might fight us instead of helping us. Then we adapt, Bjorn replied simply. But I don't think that will happen. Blood calls to blood, and brothers don't forget sisters easily, no matter what they've endured. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ingrid, who approached with the careful dignity of someone delivering news she wished she didn't have to share. Her face was pale but determined, and she carried herself with the bearing of a woman who had accepted a difficult decision. I'm coming with you, she announced without preamble. Absolutely not, Astrid replied immediately. You have children to think about, a husband who needs you. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment Thorvald threatened our village, Ingrid said firmly. Besides, you'll need someone who can tend wounds if things go badly, and I'm the best healer. We have after old Helga. Ingrid, the decision is made, Astrid. Olaf understands. The children have been placed with families who will care for them, and my healing supplies are already packed. Ingrid's voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had weighed all possibilities and chosen the path of greatest honor. You're my dearest friend, and I won't let you face this alone. The addition of Ingrid to their small force changed the dynamics of the plan, but not necessarily for the worse. Her presence would lend credibility to the story that Astrid was genuinely surrendering. After all, what warrior would bring her closest friend along if she were playing treachery? And her healing skills might prove invaluable if the rescue attempt succeeded, but left them with wounded to care for Dot as evening approached and the time for departure drew near. The village gathered to see them off. It was a somber ceremony, lacking the usual songs and boasts that accompanied warriors heading to battle. Everyone understood that this might be farewell forever, that the small group preparing to ride into the winter darkness might never return to the warm halls of home. Children pressed small tokens into their hands-carved wooden animals, braided grass rings, stones painted with protected runes. Elders offered blessings and whispered prayers to gods both old and new. Young warriors who had been deemed too inexperienced for such a dangerous mission stood silent and proud. their faces reflecting the mixture of envy and relief that came from being both excluded from glory and spared from likely death. "Remember," Magnus said as they mounted their horses, "if you don't return by dawn, we'll assume the worst and begin preparations for siege. The village will hold as long as possible, but we won't surrender. Whatever happens to you, know that your sacrifice will be honored and remembered." "We'll return," Bjorn said with quiet confidence. "All of us, and with Ragnar. This isn't a suicide mission. It's a rescue, and rescues only work if everyone comes home." As they rode out into the gathering darkness, following game trails that would bring them to Thorvald's camp from an unexpected direction, Astrid found herself thinking about the marriage cloak she had left unfinished on her bed. The silver thread she had woven into the dark wool caught moonlight, the same way hope caught despair, transforming something ordinary into something beautiful, something worth preserving. Behind them, the lights of Ravenshollow grew distant and dim, until only memory connected them to the warmth and safety they had left behind. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the terrible possibility that love might not be enough to overcome the darkness that had claimed her brother's heart. But as she felt the weight of Bjorn's father's shield across her back and heard the steady breathing of friends who had chosen to risk everything for her family, Astrid allowed herself to believe that perhaps, sometimes, it was enough to try. Perhaps the attempt itself had value, regardless of outcome. Perhaps the willingness to risk everything for those you loved was its own form of victory, win or lose. The winter wind carried with it the scent of snow and pine, and somewhere in that vast darkness ahead, a brother waited to learn whether his sister's love was strong enough to bring him home. The longhouse was already burning. When they created the ridge overlooking Thorvald's camp, its ancient timbers sending columns of orange flame into the winter sky like the fingers of some desperate god reaching toward the stars. The sight struck Astrid with unexpected force, not because she hadn't anticipated violence, but because the burning building looked so much like the great hall of Ravenshollow that for one heart-stopping moment she thought they had arrived too late, that Thorvald's forces had somehow circled behind them and destroyed everything they loved. "It's not our hall," Bjorn said quietly, understanding her fear without need for explanation. "Look at the construction, older style, different proportions. This is one of Thorvald's own buildings." Relief and new worry warred in Astrid's chest as she studied the scene below. The enemy camp sprawled across a natural meadow protected by hills on three sides, with perhaps 80 warriors visible in the firelight. But the burning longhouse suggested internal conflict of some kind, dissension in the ranks that might work to their advantage, or might indicate that their careful plan had already been discovered and was burning along with Thorvald's hall. "There," Eric whispered, pointing toward a cluster of figures near the fire. "The big man with the silver arm rings, that has to be Thorvald himself." Even at this distance, Thorvald the Cruel was an imposing figure. Tall as Bjorn, but broader. In the shoulders, he moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to absolute authority. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and his face bore the ritual scars that marked him as a follower of the old god's most violent aspects. Around him stood his inner circle-hard men with calculating eyes and weapons that had seen extensive use. "And there's Ragnar," Astrid breathed, her heart clenching with joy and grief in equal measure. Her brother stood at Thorvald's right hand, close enough to be within easy reach, but positioned like a bodyguard rather than a prisoner. 5 years had changed him dramatically. The boy she remembered had become a man, broader through chest and shoulders, with new scars marking his arms and face. His hair was longer than Viking custom usually permitted, braided with small bones and metal ornaments that spoke of many successful raids. But it was the expression on his face that struck her most deeply cold, watchful, empty of the warmth and humor she remembered. "He doesn't look like a prisoner," Ingrid observed with quiet concern. "No," Astrid agreed reluctantly. He looks like exactly what Thorvald claimed, a champion, a right-hand man, someone who has found his place among the enemy. The thought that her brother might have genuinely turned against everything they had been raised to value was almost more than she could bear. But dwelling on it would serve no purpose except to undermine her resolve when she needed it most. "The plan remains the same," Bjorn said firmly. "We approach under the white banner, claiming that Astrid has come to accept Thorvald's offer. Once we're close enough, we strike fast and hard, aiming to take out their leadership before they can organize resistance. And if Ragnar fights us, then we do what we must," Astrid replied, though the words felt like swallowing broken glass. "The village comes first. It has to." They descended toward the camp in single file, their horses picking their way carefully through the rocky terrain. Bjorn led the way carrying a spear with a white cloth tied near the point, the universal symbol of peaceful intent, though they all knew how quickly peace could turn to violence if circumstances demanded it. The guards who challenged them at the camp's perimeter were professionals, alert and suspicious despite the late hour. Their leader, a scarred man with filed teeth, examined the white banner with obvious skepticism. "State your business," he growled, one hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "I am Astrid Ironwill of Ravenshollow," Astrid replied with carefully calculated arrogance. "I've come to speak with Thorvald concerning his offer. I trust he's still interested in adding a proven warrior to his ranks." The guard's eyes widened slightly at her name, and he gestured for one of his companions to carry word to their leader. While they waited, Astrid forced herself to remain calm despite the growing certainty that their small deception would be uncovered before they could get close enough to matter. "Thorvald will see you," the guard announced after a tense interval. "But your weapons stay here, and your friends wait outside the inner circle." "Acceptable," Astrid replied, though every instinct screamed against entering the enemy camp unarmed. "My companions understand that this is my choice to make." As they surrendered their visible weapons, keeping the concealed knives that might mean the difference between success and disaster, Astrid caught sight of Ragnar watching them from across the firelit space. For just a moment, their eyes met, across the flames and shadows, and she thought she saw something flicker in his gaze recognition, perhaps, or surprise, or some emotion too complex to name. Then Thorvald the Cruel stepped forward to greet his unexpected guests, and the moment for subtle communication passed into the realm of steel and blood. Astrid's sword shattered against Thorvald's massive war axe with a sound like breaking thunder, sending fragments of steel spinning through the firelight like deadly stars. The blade, her grandfather's work, perfectly balanced and lovingly maintained, broke cleanly just above the crossguard, leaving her holding nothing but a useless hilt while the most dangerous man in the Northern Territories raised his weapon for what would surely be a killing blow. Time seemed to slow as death approached on wings of sharpened iron. She could see the triumph in Thorvald's pale eyes, could feel the heat from the burning longhouse washing over her face like a preview of the funeral pyre she would never receive. Around them, the battle raged with desperate intensity. Bjorn fighting two men at once near the camp center, Eric and Ingrid somewhere in the chaos of fleeing raiders and falling snow. But it was Ragnar's voice that cut through the din of combat, like a blade through silk, stopping Thorvald's axe in mid-descent. "Wait," her brother called, his own sword held ready but not yet committed to either side. "She's worth more alive than dead. If you kill her now, you lose any chance of using her against Ravenshollow." Thorvald's cruel smile widened, but he held his. "Strike. You make a good point, my champion." "Very well. We'll keep the Shieldmaiden as a guest until her village sees reason." It was the opening Astrid had been praying for, the moment when arrogance would overcome caution and create opportunity from disaster. As Thorvald lowered his guard to savor his apparent victory, she lunged forward with the broken hilt, driving the jagged remains of her blade deep into the soft flesh beneath his jaw. The warlord's eyes went wide with shock and rage, blood bubbling from his lips as he tried to speak. His massive hands clutched at the wound, but Astrid was already moving, rolling away from his falling body and snatching up a fallen raider's weapon. "Ragnar!" she called to her brother, who stood frozen in apparent disbelief. "It's time to choose them or us." For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, everything hung in balance. The remaining raiders watched their fallen leader with growing panic, their organized resistance crumbling into confusion and fear. Bjorn fought his way toward them through the chaos, his own sword red to the hilt but his spirit undaunted. And Ragnar stood between past and present, family and loyalty, the boy he had been and the man 5 years with Thorvald had made him. Then her brother smiled, the same crooked grin she remembered from their childhood, and drove his blade into the back of the nearest raider. "Sister," he called over the sound of steel on steel, "I was wondering when you'd come to rescue me." The words hit her like a physical blow, carrying with them the realization that everything had been a performance, the cold demeanor, the apparent loyalty to Thorvald, the careful positioning that had allowed him to save her life at the crucial moment. Ragnar had been playing a role, waiting for his chance, surviving by seeming to serve while never forgetting who he truly was. "You planned this," she accused as they fought back to back against the remaining enemies, their movements falling into the familiar rhythm of siblings who had trained together since childhood. "I planned to survive until someone came for me," Ragnar replied, parrying a thrust and responding with a devastating riposte. "I hoped it would be you, but I wasn't certain, until I saw you ride into camp carrying father's shield." "Bjorn's father's shield," Astrid corrected. "Ah." Ragnar's grin widened even as he cut down another attacker. "Then I assume congratulations are in order." "Not yet," Bjorn interrupted, appearing beside them with Eric and Ingrid close behind. "We need to finish this fight and get home before we celebrate anything." The battle's outcome was no longer in doubt. With their leader dead and their champion revealed as a traitor, the surviving raiders broke and fled into the winter darkness, abandoning weapons and supplies in their haste to escape. Within minutes, the only sounds in the camp were the crackling of the burning longhouse and the heavy breathing of exhausted warriors. "How many did we lose?" Astrid asked as they gathered near the fire to assess their situation. "None of ours," Eric reported with satisfaction, "though we're all carrying new scars to remember the night by." Ingrid was already moving among them, with her healing supplies, cleaning wounds and applying bandages with the efficient competence that had made her invaluable to their desperate mission. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline that still coursed through all their veins, her voice calm as she gave instructions for care and recovery. "We should burn the rest of the camp," Ragnar suggested. "Leave nothing for the survivors to rally around when they work up the courage to return." "Agreed," Bjorn said. "But first, we need to hear your story." 5 years is a long time to maintain a deception like that. As they worked to destroy what remained of Thorvald's stronghold, Ragnar told them of his survival pulled from the wreckage, of the failed raid more dead than alive, nursed back to health by Thorvald's healers, then carefully groomed to become the warlord's most trusted lieutenant. He had played the role perfectly, earning trust through apparent loyalty while secretly gathering intelligence and waiting for his chance. "I knew someone would come eventually," he concluded. "Family doesn't abandon family, not among our people." As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins of their enemy's camp, the small party prepared for the journey home. They had achieved something that had seemed impossible just hours before: the rescue of a lost brother, the elimination of a deadly threat, and the preservation of everything they held dear. But the greatest victory, Astrid realized as she watched Bjorn and Ragnar work together to secure their supplies, was the proof that love and loyalty could survive even the harshest trials. Some bonds, once forged, could not be broken by time, distance, or the cruelest deceptions. Spring came early to Ravenshollow that year, melting the snow in great rushing torrents that filled the streams and turned the frozen earth to rich, dark mud that squelched underfoot and promised abundant harvest to come. The village had awakened from winter's grip, transformed not just by the season's change, but by the events that had tested every soul within its borders and revealed strengths they hadn't known they possessed. Astrid stood in the doorway of the new longhouse, watching as Bjorn and Ragnar worked together to set the final hearthstone in place. The massive block of granite had been quarried from the same formation that protected their valley, its surface polished smooth and carved with intertwined patterns that spoke of permanence and partnership. Both their names were etched into the stone in runes that would endure long after their bodies had returned to the earth. Bjorn and Astrid, joined not just in marriage, but in the kind of partnership that became legend. The hearthstone was more than decorative. It was the foundation upon which their new life would be built. Every meal cooked over its fire, every conversation shared in its warmth, every child raised within its circle would be rooted in the commitment it represented. It was a symbol of stability in a world that had proven capable of sudden, devastating change. "There," Bjorn said, straightening from his work and wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "Ready to serve the next 3 generations, assuming we raise them properly." "Speaking of raising children," Astrid said, one hand resting unconsciously on her still flat belly, "I have news that might interest you." The words hung in the air like morning mist, carrying implications that made both men stop their work and turn toward her with expressions of dawning understanding. "Are you certain?" Bjorn asked, his voice carefully controlled, though his eyes blazed with joy. "As certain as a woman can be this early. Ingrid confirmed it yesterday." Astrid smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "It seems our partnership will bear fruit sooner than expected." Ragnar let out a whoop of delight that echoed across the valley, his celebration drawing curious looks from the other villagers who were working on their own reconstruction projects. In the months since their return from Thorvald's camp, her brother had thrown himself into the work of rebuilding with the enthusiasm of someone who had been given a second chance at life. "A nephew or niece," he said with obvious satisfaction. "Someone to teach all the skills their parents are too responsible to pass on." "Don't get ahead of yourself," Astrid warned, though she was smiling. "Children need to learn wisdom before they learn mischief." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Magnus, who walked with more spring in his step than he had shown in years. The successful rescue of Ragnar and elimination of Thorvald's threat had seemed to add life to the old man's bones, as if the proof that careful planning and courageous action could still triumph over seemingly impossible odds had renewed his faith in the future. "The delegation from Ironwood arrived this morning," he announced. "They're interested in formalizing the alliance we discussed: mutual defense, shared trade routes, coordinated responses to external threats." It was welcome news. The victory over Thorvald had enhanced Ravenshollow's reputation among the neighboring settlements, but it had also made clear that isolated communities were vulnerable to the kinds of threats that required coordinated responses. The alliance Magnus had been negotiating would provide security without sacrificing independence, exactly the kind of practical wisdom that had kept their village thriving for generations. "What do they want in return?" Bjorn asked. "Access to our smiths for weapons and tools, and a promise to stand with them if the southern clans become aggressive again." Magnus stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. "Fair terms, I think. We get security, they get quality ironwork, and everyone benefits from increased trade." As the elder moved on to share the news with other families, Astrid found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that autumn evening when Bjorn had first declared his unconventional requirements for a wife. The woman who had stood in the great hall that night, uncertain and defensive, seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone who had learned that strength and gentleness were not opposites, but partners. That the fiercest warriors could also be the most nurturing partners, and that true partnership meant supporting each other's growth rather than demanding perfection. "What are you thinking about?" Bjorn asked, moving to stand beside her in the doorway. "About how different everything looks from where we started," Astrid replied. 6 months ago, I was convinced that choosing between the warrior path and the domestic path was the most important decision I'd ever make. Now I understand that the choice was never between them. It was about finding someone who'd help me be excellent at both. "And have you found that someone?" She turned to face him fully, taking in the scars that marked his hands and forearms, the silver threads that streaked his dark hair, the laugh lines that had deepened around his eyes during their months of courtship and partnership. He was not the perfect husband of romantic tales. He was something far better. He was real, flawed, constantly growing, and absolutely committed to building something beautiful together. "I have," she said simply. "Though I suspect he's still wondering if I'm worth the trouble." "Every day," Bjorn replied with mock seriousness. "But then you do something like charge into an enemy camp to rescue your brother, or announce that you're carrying our child. And I remember why I was willing to wait 37 years to find you." As evening settled over the valley and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the three of them sat by their new hearth, sharing a simple meal and planning for tomorrow's work. Ragnar told stories of his years with Thorvald's raiders, not the sanitized versions fit for mixed company, but the real tales of survival, compromise, and the slow, careful work of maintaining hope in impossible circumstances. Bjorn spoke of his plans for expanding their fields and perhaps building a small dock for fishing boats. Astrid listened to both of them while her hand rested on her belly, imagining the child who would grow up hearing these stories and learning from these examples of what it meant to be strong, loyal, and true. Outside, the village settled into its nightly rhythms, but within the circle of their firelight, the future seemed bright with possibility. They had faced the worst that winter and war could offer, and they had emerged not just intact but stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as they had learned to meet everything else together, with courage and with the unshakable knowledge that some bonds were strong enough to survive anything the world might devise to test them.